Greetings, Hall Pass to Nowhere, followers, subscribers, listeners. It's your host, Timothy White. Before this episode starts, I wanted to come on and express a sincere apology. I had an insightful and great conversation with Dr. MacLeod. However, for some reason during this episode, I kept calling him Dr. MacLeod. But I just wanted to set the record straight that unfortunately, in post-production, I wasn't able to remove the name or re-record it to my satisfaction. I reached out to Dr. MacLeod, and he said, an apology is great. And he was too gracious. And he was like, that's too much. But I felt like I owed it to him to give an apology. So this episode that you're about to listen to or view, please know that it is Dr. Doug MacLeod, not MacLeod. And for the record, I want to express a sincere apology to Dr. Doug MacLeod on the name jumble, the name gaffe. My sincerest apologies. Nevertheless, a great conversation and insightful information. Welcome, everyone. Our guest today is a scholar who is redefining what it means to find your voice in academia. Dr. Doug MacLeod Jr. is a professor at SUNY Cobleskill. Probably Cobleskill.
No, you got it first. You got it right.
Yeah, I did it.
Yeah.
Cobleskill. But his most impactful lessons often come from a discovery he made later in life. Diagnosed with autism in his mid-40s, Dr. MacLeod has turned his diagnosis into a tool for clarity, advocacy, and teaching. Today, he's here to share how being neurodivergent has shaped his career as a communicator and how he's helping students navigate their own unique paths. Welcome, Dr. Doug MacLeod. How's it going, brother?
All right. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm doing good. I'm enjoying the experience already, which is great.
Well, I appreciate that.
Are you doing okay?
I'm doing good, man. I'm delightful. As we kind of talked about a little bit before we started the recording, I'm definitely interested in your story, and I know some of my students will hopefully be able to relate with it, and hopefully you'll be a source of inspiration. So I'm excited to talk to you.
I'm excited to talk to you as well.
So let's start. Let's dig in. What was the biggest mystery about maybe your own behavior that once you received the diagnosis, it suddenly made sense?
That's a great starting question. And I would say that it was my introversion, I guess, is the more general kind of thing. I mean, there were specific things, like, for example, while I would sit, I would rock, and, I play with my toys and when I was a kid in specific ways. And I was very quiet as a kid and stuff like that. But if you want to talk about it in a broader sort of sense, it was my introversion. And I noticed that lack of societal awareness, I suppose, was starting to kind of creep into my personal life more than anything else. Like, when you have like the societal thing, you could kind of manage it a little bit better because you don't have to go to that party. You don't have to be involved with that kind of communal sort of thing that may be happening. But when you're a married man in a relationship with somebody, and at that point when I learned about my diagnosis, my wife and I had been married probably, I want to say at that point, what is it, about 20 years or so, close to that. And it starts to creep in more and more. It's like, there's got to be something that is problematic here, right? There's something not necessarily right here. And, you go through the list, like, was it my parents' fault? Was it was it not necessarily my mom, more so my father, but, like what, was it this person, and then, you realize, no, it's really me. I don't know exactly what it is. And then, so what ended up happening was I was withdrawing a lot. I decided to go to therapy, went to my first therapist, which we could talk about it a little bit later. With, if you want, it was a little problematic for me. But the second person that I went to pointed it out to me, said, I think you may be on the spectrum. And I was like, okay, you maybe, like you don't really think about it. But then as time goes on, you realize, man, astute observation. Uh,
Right. Right.
and it's like, okay, you know what? You're right. You're right. And, and then you take the time after that to adjust. So I would say, in the broader sense of the word, broader sense of it, the introversion, the lack of societal awareness, and then we had those little things in between that you're like, oh, okay, now it makes much more sense.
Gotcha. So you mentioned that the therapist kind of mentioned, hey, you may be on the spectrum. Is that what led to you, I guess, seeking the diet? I don't want to say seeking, that's probably a bad word, but is that what led to you saying, hey, I need to go down this path a little more and see, is this true or not?
Mm-hmm. I was seeking, when I went to therapy the first time around, I was seeking clarity.
Okay.
And I was trying to figure out what was my problem, because I was going through a very, very difficult time personally. I was putting Band-Aids on gaping wounds.
Mm.
And what ended up happening was, I realized that wasn't working. So the first person that I spoke with, and we could talk about the first therapist, his intentions were quite good. I don't, deny that. But basically he said, listen, exercise more, drink more water, and be more connected to God, and everything should be fine. And it's like, okay, that could only go so far, right? And I consider myself a faith-filled person. I do believe in God, I believe in Jesus Christ, and I'm Roman Catholic, but I don't know necessarily if me doing more push-ups and drinking 68 liter, whatever it is, 68 liters of water or
Ounces.
whatever
Yeah.
is gonna wash this away, right?
Right.
And so what ended up happening I wanted to seek more clarity about that. And so what ended up happening was I found someone else. It was by mistake kind of thing, but it ended up being kind of kismet. And I think that's what it was. I was seeking clarity at first, and then I gave my thought processes to the therapist, what was going on with me, and he kind of just pointed it out based on what I was speaking to him about, and also my reactions to things, and my behaviors while I was speaking to him. And he pointed it out. And at first you're like, oh yeah, okay, you know. But as I mentioned before, you and in a way you don't want to believe it.
Mm.
Yeah, because I'm not sure how old you are, Timothy. I'm 50. I just turned 50 this year, and I don't know if you remember Rain Man, but when you think about, in my generation, when I was growing up, that is what you thought of autism, right? That's how you thought of it. It was that extreme Dustin Hoffman version of what that meant. And so, at first you're thinking, oh, no, and I knew there was a spectrum at that point. It wasn't like I didn't know, but you're still thinking, I'm not at that point, right? But then all of a sudden, as I said, the clouds start to kind of dissipate. You're like, oh, okay. That makes so much more sense. That makes so much more sense to me. That's why I was like that. That's why I did that. That's why I am the way that I am now. And so, yeah, so I think what it was at first I was seeking clarity, and I got it, which is a wonderful sort of thing, right?
Right.
When you finally do reach that point. I'm not sure if I answered your question or
No, you did. You did.
not.
You
Okay.
very much did.
Okay.
Because I'm always interested because it seems like I have encountered several people as of late that have received some type of diagnosis late in life,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's ADHD, whether it's autism, or another learning challenge or whatever, dyslexia, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm always just so intrigued on, okay, how did it come to be? Like, how did this come to be later in life?
Right.
And
Right.
so, no, you very much answered the question. And so you also kind of talked about, it seemed like you kind of didn't want to accept it at first a little bit, at least internally, maybe.
Yes, absolutely. At first, I didn't want to accept it. More so, I didn't want to accept the concept of taking medication, which was
Mm,
something which also took place. That was more of an issue for me, because I'm an older man, and so I already take other types of medication. But taking medication was something that was interesting, and then you have to then you have to explain this to your wife. Then you have to explain this to your mother, your father, your brother, your cousin, any family members who wish to learn more about it, right? So
right,
so that's and how difficult is that for someone who is on the spectrum, who has anxiety and fear in social situations, and being constantly uncomfortable with the world around you,
right,
right? So that's how it was. So I didn't want to accept it, and I think the reason why I didn't want to accept it was because I didn't want to continue to be uncomfortable. But what I did learn in my therapy was this: that I was living a life of either being more uncomfortable or less uncomfortable. I was not ever comfortable, right? And so, in a way, you know, in learning that aspect of things, it made it a little bit easier for me to say, okay, well, if I was never comfortable to begin with, then this is just kind of par for the course, right?
right.
And so now I can that's something I could work off of. And ultimately what ended up happening was you start to tell people about what it is that you're going through. Tell them about your experience, not blaming other people for your experience. And then allowing those individuals that are around you to kind of figure it out on their own as to how to respond to that sort of thing. And I cannot change those individuals.
No, no,
I can't change their responses. I can't change their thought processes as much as I want to. I can't do that, right? And so that's the next level after that. So yeah, it was hard to learn how to accept that, and to be honest, I think it was probably hard for the people around me to learn that
right.
for a while.
So I'm going to fast forward just a little bit,
Sure.
but because I love that you're so transparent about it. I love that you're very open, and you've even used it to inspire you and share it with your students, and speaking engagements. You don't shy away from it. All those things. At what point did you make the decision to say, okay, I've got to infuse this with who I am as Dr. MacLeod, the professor, or you know keynote speaking, or any other speaking engagement you have? At what point did you decide that you're just gonna be open book essentially?
I think it was maybe a little bit later on. I would say certainly was later on in my therapy, but I think what it was I realized over time that if I were to be more open about who I am and not hide it, I I think what it would have done is, or what it would do, is help those individuals that I am teaching, because there are many students who are neurodivergent in my classes, whether it involves, as you mentioned, ADHD, dyslexia. As I said, I'm on the spectrum. I have an overactive brain as well. Individuals who are on the spectrum. I think what it was maybe this is where it happened. I was the chair of my department during COVID, and that was a difficult time for me. I had become the chair. I was supposed to do a 3-year term. I did a 2-year term, and then what ended up happening was I started getting panic attacks where I actually thought I had to. Was having a heart attack. I had to got a Holter monitor put on. I wanted to make sure that it was okay. And I think what it was I had to realize on some level that this was not something that I could do. This is not something that is in my wheelhouse
Mm,
necessarily. And so I ended up, letting the school know that I couldn't do this, that it was causing me mental strain and mental health problems. And then I wanted to, maybe there was a form of me that wanted to justify it in some way. And so I was very I started becoming a little bit more transparent to my colleagues after I was transparent to my family and friends and stuff like that, and my wife. And I think that's what started it. Maybe that's where it was. It was like I can't hide this anymore
Right.
about myself. If I do, it may affect my ability to work, and ultimately, I was worried, maybe even concerned about career kind of things that were happening. And I'm just that's more of a introspective sort of thing right now.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily maybe full on what the problem was, but I would say that maybe that's where it was.
Hmm.
Where I said, you know what, maybe being more transparent could be helpful for me so that they know why it is that I'm doing what I'm doing. And for people who are, most people are pretty, are good and embrace that sort of thing. But I recognize, though, I think I also recognize that my students needed that. They need to know that there are people out there like them. And let's face it, and you probably could feel this, maybe being a special ed teacher. There are more individuals who are being diagnosed, and they need assistance. And sometimes that assistance is coming from people who have similar problems and issues, and they should know that. And to say you could be successful in your world even with the challenges that you may have, right?
That's a perfect segue into my next question. I love it. Um, because my next question is basically, can you kind of tell us about the culture shift that happened in your classroom, or if you noticed a culture shift with your students from being open about their diagnosis?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. I had students who were coming to me and who still come to me and say, I'm neurodivergent myself. Thank you for being so honest about it. I think people have a better understanding of why it is that I grade the way that I do, or why it is that I lecture the way that I do. Or, being a communication professor, my official title at Cobleskill, now it's considered a Cobleskill Ag and Tech now.
Okay.
Um, they just recently rebranded. Cobleskill Ag and Tech is Professor of Composition and Communication. And so I want them to understand that as someone who may be neurodivergent, that you can be a decent enough communicator. And there are other ways or other forms of communication that don't necessarily have to be verbal, right? And so these particular students that I have are potential journalists, videographers, photographers, writers, but even just thinking about people who are lawyers or that sort of thing. Being in the communication field, you have this kind of interdisciplinary sort of way of doing things, right? And so I have one individual who became a reporter and stuff like that. So what I think it has done is it shows individuals that their voice can be heard in a variety of ways, as opposed to just the one way that we have an understanding of. And even thinking about it from the perspective of what we're doing here, before COVID, I don't think that this was something that was. I mean, it was possible, but it wasn't as prominent as what took place after COVID. And I think with COVID, we have a better understanding of better understanding that there are different modes of communication that are out there, and students, I think, appreciate that about me, that I could say, have your voice. It's okay to have your voice, but that doesn't mean necessarily the voice has to be just this, right? It could, and I'm pointing to my for those people listening to the podcast, pointing to my neck and my my throat. It could be something else, and so yeah, so a lot of students appreciate that, and that's what I'm seeing. That's what I'm seeing from my students when they come and chat with me in my office hours, or in my classes, or are getting jobs outside after they leave the school.
I would imagine that makes you. Well, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I would imagine that would make you kind of in my opinion, a step above the average professor, because here's this thing that you may share with the student,
Mhm.
and with your openness, I think I would imagine that it probably lowers it probably makes students feel more comfortable to come to you and have some probably deep conversations or very practical conversations that they may not feel comfortable to have with another professor.
I appreciate that, and my ego tells me yes, because that's what, as a professor, I always say we have egos. But in all seriousness, I think we live in a very. I'm part of a universal design committee, and I think what it is that we all have different ways of learning, and so as much as I say that, there may be as much as you may say that, and I agree with you that there are students who are more than willing to feel comfortable with me, that sort of thing. Then maybe other, say, for example, neurotypical type of students who are very uncomfortable with those types of conversations and discussions.
Right.
And so, as much as I would like to believe that every one of my students, when they hear how I go about presenting my identity, how I go about identifying and how I go about presenting myself, that they're all going to be like, man, this guy is fantastic, But there may be some people who are just afraid to converse with me because of it. They don't know how to deal with individuals who are on the spectrum. They don't know necessarily how to deal with somebody who has these kind of social problems or issues. Some people like to be looked at right in, like right in the eye,
Yeah.
right? And when they're talking to them. And if you've noticed, I kind of look around when I'm, look around when I don't look right into the camera, right? And it's
Right.
because that's not the way that I do things. So some people are much more direct, and they may feel uncomfortable with the fact that I don't stare at them while I'm
Right.
talking to them, right?
Right.
The shorter answer to this is I would like to believe that's something that a lot of students would appreciate. With that being said, universal design says no, that's not actually the case. So there are going to be people who are going to be very uncomfortable with it, who are triggered by it, and that sort of thing.
And that's an aspect that I've never really thought about too much, because I guess I've always thought, how can, this isn't fair to say. It's probably going to make me not look that smart.
You are a very smart man, Timothy. You're a very smart man.
But I guess
based on the questions that you're asking, I can tell.
I try, but sometimes I have trouble accepting, or I have trouble really processing people that are in the majority feeling triggered, if that makes sense. And that's probably my own thing. It's like, well, if everywhere you go, or most of the places you go, the world it's accommodating to you, and
right.
we're trying to say, hey, step back to think about others that may not be neurotypical, that are neuroatypical. I don't know. I haven't tried. That's my own internal thing that I'm trying to still rectify.
No, and no, that makes a lot of sense. And let me say this: I had a colleague once. I was teaching a race and gender in American film class, and I had this particular individual tell me that, based on the fact that I'm a white heterosexual male, that I shouldn't be teaching. Essentially, I shouldn't be. No, she was surprised that I was teaching that specific class.
Right.
Wasn't necessarily she said I shouldn't be, even though in her mind she probably, and I don't want to go into the agenda of that particular individual, but that was the thought processes. And then at that moment, this actually happened twice with the same individual. The first time around, I was not aware of my identity, how I now identify, right? But and that second time around, I was, and I said, you know what? I just want to let you know, I'm on the spectrum, and as much as I may look like a white heterosexual male, I have a little bit of Native American culture. My father is mainly German, but also Scottish and Native American.
Okay.
So I do have Native American blood, right? It's not. I'm not going to say I identify as Native American. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm certainly not going to do that, right? But you may have a perception based on what you know of me by looking at me to say that you're just a white heterosexual male, right? But we all have we all have, we're all part of the world, and we all
Yeah.
part of communities, and we all have different types of communities. And, whether or not you're part of the LGBTQIA plus community, whether you're part of the neurodivergent community, whether you're part of the, physical disability community, invisible disability community, we're all part of some forms of communities. What you do is, and we place ourselves into these particular boxes, right? What ends up happening is that other people are going to have those different perceptions of who you are. And sometimes you have to enlighten them to be able to say, hey, that's not what it is. And yes, I do identify as a male. I do identify as heterosexual. I do identify as Roman Catholic, and the idea of identification in and of itself doesn't necessarily have to be this monolithic sort of thing.
Nope.
Right. So that's what I think it is. I think when we have our perceptions are reality. And what ends up happening is that there are going to be moments where all of a sudden we get that slap in the face, and it's like, oh no, that's not the truth of the matter, right? And sometimes it's up to us as the individuals within that community to give them the slap in the face, right? Right, and that's just the way it is. So, and I don't think that there's any malintent or ill intent when it comes to that sort of thing. I think just sometimes people are live in their bubble a little bit, and it's like, okay, sometimes you got to, pop it a little bit and say, hey, you may have a perception of me, but that's not what the perception is. And this was the other point I wanted to make. Why can't I teach it? I have a bachelor's degree in film. I have a master's degree in film studies. My doctoral dissertation was on depoliticization and film adaptation. I've written tons of articles and book reviews based in film studies. So why wouldn't I be able to teach race and gender in film? It's not like I may be, I may not be a black man, but that doesn't mean necessarily I can't teach about how people represent the black experience within cinema. Right? Within cinema, it's different. You know what I mean? So I'm not speaking as a black man teaching, about the black experience. What I'm saying is Spike Lee, for example, in Do the Right Thing is representing the black experience in this specific way. So now, how do we go about dealing with that aspect of things, and how does he see the black experience through his eyes, as opposed to, say, for example, the Hughes brothers? You know what I mean? So I that doesn't seem unreasonable to do analysis in that way.
Right.
Right. So, you could be empathetic, and think about it as a person who's sitting here, I'm not going to not watch Sinners, for example, because I'm not a black man.
Right.
Right. I mean, I'm going to watch it. And so I'm going to have a perception of what that is based on what my experience is. So why not discuss that? I don't know.
No.
It seems unreasonable to me not to.
Right. No, I hear you. I hear you. I think, man, that's one of those that's, I think knowing our identity is a very powerful, probably very freeing and very, cathartic thing process itself. Right. I also do wonder, and this is another, internal thing, introspective thing, is I also wonder, is some of that causing more division amongst us because we want to say, you can't do that because you're not this. You can't do that because you're not this. And I do feel like in some ways, is it going to get to a point where if you're teaching a class on, being neurodivergent, do you have to be a neurodivergent to teach his class?
Right.
And what that's going to do. I do worry about that. I do, but I also do think it's a fine line because I think sometimes classes can be taught where it feels like someone who is not of that identity is trying to portray the experience from their own perspective. It's like you have no dog in the fight.
That's where the difference lies. That's where the difference lies. If I were to say I understand the black experience, then that's not in any way, shape, or form true.
Right.
Right. I mean, there's no truth to that commentary. And if I were to say, even and being a Native American individual, having mild amount of Native American blood, To say that I know what the Native American experience is like right now,
Right.
absolutely not. I don't understand that experience, right? But what I can say is how it's represented in a particular film, movie, or social media platform or something along those lines, and I could somewhat empathize with those individuals based on my experience as a neurodivergent person, right? Feeling othered or whatever the case may be.
Right.
That's something that I can do. That's where truth lies. If you start to say, I understand that experience because, no, 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 you
Right.
can't. There's
Right.
no possible way to do that. And as a neurodivergent person, that's where I think that's another aspect of the uncomfortability, right? I'm comfortable with me saying this. Much more, I'm less uncomfortable with me saying this now than I was maybe several years ago. And believe me, man, I've made my mistakes when it comes to that sort of stuff too.
Hmm.
I've said things, I've done things in classes, especially 10 years ago that I wouldn't do now, and because of the new ways of how we go about looking at the world, right?
Right.
And the other aspect of this is change. I was just watching something about, I remember Ricky Gervais was talking about Kevin Hart and was talking about he was going to host the Golden Globes, I think it was. And then there was some tweets that came out in reference to the LGBT community and how the LGBTQIA plus community and how his son, Kevin Hart's son, was, he was saying something that was kind of connected to that. And Ricky Gervais says, but he came out, he apologized for it, he moved on, he mea culpa sort of situation. And then, but then he was ended up being pushed out of the Golden Globes. He says, well, what kind of world are we going to live in if, where we can't apologize for the things that we do and people accept those apologies for what we do, right?
True story.
I mean, if we don't accept those apologies, then we're not getting anywhere. It's kind of similar to that of like Do the Right Thing, right? Where Radio Raheem is talking to Spike Lee's character, he's like love and hate, right? And he says, and if you have if you have those two things as static, that's taking place. He says, but if you have love and hate together, then and he does, and in my estimation, this is what he's saying is conversation could finally happen, right? We could finally discuss what it is that is taking place in our world, right? And I think that's important to recognize. We need to have these conversations. It's an absolute necessity. And as a neurodivergent person who doesn't want to have those conversations, who's uncomfortable with having those kind of conversations,
Right.
it's like, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to be uncomfortable with that. I want us to have that conversation. Because if we don't have that conversation, we cannot figure out a solution to the problem. There's no
Right.
possible way we can. If we just hide in our little bubbles, as I
Oh,
said,
absolutely not. Absolutely not.
or within our community.
Oh, that too. Very
Yeah,
much.
yeah,
Very much so.
yeah.
So when we've talked a lot about, the neurodivergent experience from, different perspectives and how you're using it to advocate and, from an education perspective
Mhm.
and what, trying to be careful how I phrase this.
You don't have to be too careful.
I don't have to be too careful. How can higher education, and this is probably too broad, but in this moment, I don't know any other way to phrase this.
Yeah,
How can higher education better support neurodivergent students? Yeah, how can higher education better support neurodivergent students?
yeah. That's a great question. What I would say is making sure that there is a platform that is based in universal design, right? The idea of ensuring that every individual at least has some form of way of being able to learn within the classroom experience, right? And it's up, and in a lot of ways, we can't leave it up to administrations or administrators and that sort of thing. We got to leave it up to those that are in the classroom, boots on the ground sort of thing, where they have autonomy to make sure of that. Now, I think administrators and individuals who are within the special ed universe and that sort of thing should provide us with insights to help us out with those sorts of things. But it's up to us as professors and teachers to implement those sorts of things within the classroom, you know. So if you have a YouTube video, make sure you put the closed captioning up, right? Simple little things like that, it can be of great benefit to individuals in the class that, say, for example, have hearing impairments or that sort of thing, right? I think a lot of that has to do, if we allow, you know, like for example, I'm part of a SUNY system, right?
Okay.
The SUNY system is there are multiple colleges within this one, thing called SUNY. If we allow the SUNY system to do it, as much as they may have a good intentions, it's not going to go anywhere. You know, a lot of that stuff dies on the vine, right? So as a professor, as a teacher, what is it that they say? Do what you're going to do and then ask for permission later, type of thing, right? As instructors, sometimes we have to say, well, you know what? I had one issue where a professor was talking about how one individual had a family member who was sick or something like that, wanted to make sure, but there was no phone in the classroom, right? And so, but there should have been a phone in the classroom to ensure that, and went through this whole thing with the phone. And what I did was I got in touch with, the provost and the of the college and chair and, you just basically went through a whole bunch of channels to ensure that a phone was placed into that. And it was not my fight to fight, but I felt like this person had a right to say what it is that they wanted to say and had a very feasible, reasonable reason to ensure that the phone was in there. Right now, by the way, I don't know if the phone was ever placed in there, just as a thing, right? But the idea is the wheels are kind of, we could be a squeaky wheel, but that doesn't mean necessarily out of that too that there's going to be a lot of wheels that are squeaky,
Right.
and it takes time for those types of things to happen. So as it pertains to higher education, we need to start to focus on universal design. Some colleges, including mine, I think anyway, and I don't want to be as an asterisk type of thing, get rid of SATs, get rid of Regent scores. I have a lot of problems with those types of things. I was a horrible test taker, which now I realize why. I was really bad. The SATs were horrendous for me, and now I have a doctoral degree, right? So to place our thoughts on what an SAT score is, I think that's problematic. I think testing is problematic. Common Core is problematic. In my state, that's what we have, and there's a Common Core. Some states implement it, some states don't. I think it's a problem. So yeah, so from my perspective, I think that's where we need to go. I think we need to have more of a universal design, and I think we need to stop thinking about things in a monolithic sense.
You've mentioned the term universal design. I've had some exposure to it. I feel like on a lower level.
Okay.
I definitely need to dig into it more.
Yeah.
Would you mind kind of going into, I guess, your understanding or your experience or how universal design how that benefits all learners and I'm mainly doing it more so for my audience because my audience is comprised of educators and parents and families and just some people that are just passionate or curious about education. So I want to make sure that they understand some of these terms that us educators just kind of use regularly.
Yeah. Well, we use the term universal design, but what it is meant to be is that there's an equitable thing that's taking place within the classroom where everyone has the ability to be able to learn from the experience that they have, right? That they're having within the classroom. Uh, the the problem with that is when we say universal design is that it's very individualistic, and we're still kind of in a way of teaching things in a very, there's 20 students and we're in the front of the classroom and we're teaching, right? What happens, I think, what when it comes to universal design too, I for me to define that, I remember going to the person who deals primarily with this at my institution at SUNY Cobleskill, and I had mentioned this is the things that I'm doing. She says, "You're doing it already in the classroom." So it's not like I wasn't doing it, but I didn't necessarily. I wasn't even capable of being able to verbalize what it was doing. There are people who have expertise in that. Let me just say that. Where what I do in my classes is I make sure that, for example, we have what's called bright space, and bright space is used in a lot of higher education facilities. And in bright space, you can use, you could record your voice. You can use writing if you wish to do so. If you want to type it out, you can. If you have, uh, say, if you, when you, as I said, with YouTube videos, make sure that they're going to be accessible to everybody, right? Make sure that anyone who can view those particular things are able to hear those particular things as well. Recognize and just be aware that there are going to be people in the class who have different learning styles. Okay, so for example, there may be someone who can't handwrite an assignment in the classroom, right? Who have I had one student once who had several strokes. I believe it was several strokes, and so it was very hard for that particular individual to handwrite things, right? Um, and when I think about it, I think we need to think about universal design also from the perspective of economics and that sort of thing too. If a person doesn't have a computer, allow them the opportunity to handwrite it if they need to handwrite it. If they don't have a cell phone, the idea is to accommodate,
Right.
right? Be accommodating. You don't have to take away all of your standards. That's not something you have to do. What you need to do is just accommodate. So if the person, say, for example, has a family member who they're taking care of, right? And they can't get the work done today. They need 3 more days to work on it. Give them the 3 days, right? I mean, that's how I look at universal design. Is like, I'm not saying you can't have a syllabus. I'm not saying you can't have standards for your attendance. I'm not saying that you have to mess with your grading in any way, shape, or form. But if a person just comes to you and says, I really don't understand this. Can I get a couple more days to fix it? Give them the chance to fix it. That's what it boils down to. So maybe my understanding of universal design is a little bit more pedestrian. Is that the right word for it? Like, it's not, there's not an administrative way of looking at it from my perspective, right?
Right.
Or theoretical way of looking at it. It's more of a human way of looking at it. If a
I was going to
person's,
say,
if a
I was
person's
going to,
communicating something to you,
mhm,
just accommodate that individual if they need the accommodation.
absolutely. The one word that kept just jumping in my brain or screaming in my brain as you were talking about universal design is empathy. To me,
Right,
that's
right,
it. As simple as that.
right. I tell my students years ago during the time when we had the Trump Clinton debates and stuff. I always tell students, if you ever want to watch the best presidential debates in the world, from my perspective, Romney and Obama, when they were doing their when they were these are two rhetoricians at work that knew how to really play it. But once we started to see Trump and Clinton, it changed the dynamic. And I said, and Martin Luther King also says this in a letter from a Birmingham jail on some level too, is apathy and indifference is what the problem is going to be in the world. It's
Mm,
not going to be a lot, if we have people who are passionate about what it is they believe in, whether on one side or the other, and we can have conversations and we can fix the problems, that's good. But once we start not caring and once we start to be indifferent, Eli Wiesel says this too, the person who wrote Night. He says, apathy and indifference, if those are the two things that are going to destroy not just the country, but our world. And we're starting to see that more and more, and we have an obligation as teachers to make sure that our students are being taught to care. And and with the universal design component of it, that's one way of showing that. And as long as we could care for people, care for our students on some level, then it works. And let me just say this too. I want to mention this too. Sometimes I fail at that.
right.
For those who may be listening, I want to let people know that I am not perfect at this.
No.
Being on the spectrum means also that sometimes I understand this about myself. Sometimes I'm a little bit too objective as opposed to subjective. And what ends up happening is I may seem cold sometimes, or I may seem distant, or I may not necessarily connect, or sometimes I won't be empathetic to a particular student. After you hear it over and over and over again, sometimes you want to just bang your head against the wall, right? The thing is though, you learn from those experiences and you say, okay, how can I make things better? And that's the thing. So I want to make sure people recognize too that I don't think of myself as this being this kind of godlike figure in the classroom. I don't.
Right.
I make a million mistakes, and recognizing that I think is extremely significant. I think it's important to do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Doug MacLeod, it has been a very insightful, just under an hour here.
Yeah.
But any final words or final thoughts before we sign off here?
Well, I want to thank you, Timothy, for being first of all, for you are doing the yeoman's work as well, and being a special ed teacher. For those of you who are out there who are educators, just understand, that you are doing amazing work, and you are really helping those individuals out there that need the assistance. And if you need assistance, make sure that you try to find it yourself, right? The fact is that you cannot continue to live your life, and this is something that I've learned being now that I'm on the spectrum and going to therapy and all that sort of thing. Sometimes you can't put, as I said, put band-aids on gaping wounds. That is not something that you can do. What you need to do is, if you're making mistakes, if you're making errors, ask those questions of yourself, look within yourself, and find ways to fix the problem. And I can guarantee you, based on my experience anyway, that it really enriches you, and it becomes something that is extremely helpful for you moving forward in both your professional and personal life.
Well said. And I want to thank you for engaging in a conversation that helps redefine education.
Thank you very much, sir.